Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to it as well. If you'll give me a second to share my screen, and I hope that goes without hitches. Okay. Can everyone see my screen just fine? Yes. Okay.
Yeah, we
Great.
can see it at the moment. It's on the thesis at the moment. Yeah, context, that's fine.
Well, I think that the presentation that I'm going to give in many ways follows on from what we've just heard from Daniela. So thank you very much for a great preface, somehow laying the foundations for what I want to talk about. My suspicion is that the way I'm going to talk about my view of digitality and the way I use it might align with the synthetic and anthropological models that you described. But I also see a bit of the synthetic in it as well. So I'd be just curious to see what other people think about the connections between the two. But this will be a very high-level reflection on how I thought about the different contexts involved in the research that I was doing. I will try to walk you through as best I can how I came to some general principles that guided my approach to method, analysis, and the determination of an appropriate conceptual outcome for all that work. And so to clarify the title, I won't be spending time on various theories of hermeneutics, theological or social scientific. Hermeneutics here represents a general philosophical posture I think digitality can yield. And that's a posture of revelation aided by introspection. And the basic hermeneutic I think I discovered is what I will be calling revelation by obfuscation. So in May 2024, I passed my PhD, Viva. It was thank you very much. It was a product of a 3.5-year period of thinking theologically and philosophically about what digitality, how that impacts our understanding of being human. During initial secondary research, I was intrigued that most scholars worried about loss of reflexivity as a key effect of social media use. And yet reflexivity is a putative spirit of the modern individual consciousness. Together with autonomy and authenticity, it is part of a holy or unholy trinity of theories of the modern self. If social media are destroying reflexivity, was the modern self dying? And if so, what would emerge in its place? But was this even true everywhere? Rather than dive headlong on the word of, for the most part, European and American scholars, I decided to check first in Ghana. I set about writing a thesis entitled A Philosophical Theology of Personhood in the Digital, the Case of Ghana's Young Christians. It focused on the themes authority, which is related to the modern discourse of autonomy, authenticity, and reflexivity. I employed group interviews, one-on-one interviews, that is, and online content analysis. I also used philosophical theological reflection on that data and secondary sources. My aim was for a theological anthropological output. Now, a question arose. How deeply should I engage so-called Western thought? It was, after all, a study about Ghana. You could see it that way. It was clear that for the social scientific discussions of authority, authenticity, and reflexivity, this was not too much of a problem, as it was possible to find Ghanaian and African philosophical inflections of those concepts to balance the discourse with. The real issue lay with the theological construction I was aiming for. What would I be conceiving as personhood in the digital? I won't go into all the details of how personhood has been theorized in the literature, but suffice it to say, it is highly culturally organized and often tensely poised between Western and non-Western, ethnic and religious, individualist or communitarian, and other lines. So identity is an issue in discussions of personhood. I opted to attempt a discussion of the human, albeit refracted through the prism of Ghanaian cultural experience. So I saw my task as a challenge to produce a view of the Ghanaian as a person rather than a view of the person as a Ghanaian. A theological anthropology of personhood, not Ghanaianness. This flows from my personal belief in the ontological sameness or unity of human being based on my commitment to material biological grounds and my theological understanding of the unity of humanity as a creature in relation to its creator. This for me is a matter of basic ontology. But how does one speak about humanness without inscribing the well-documented problems of universalist theorizing? And even if one succeeds, how does one articulate convincingly that they have? In other words, how can a case for a theological anthropology that speaks at the same time contextually and universally to human being be made? I realize at this point, some of you may already be shifting with unease, further proof of digital interactions, further proof that our digital interactions are far from disembodied. But I can't go into a defense of whether I managed. I already did that in the Viva. And you'll have to wait for the monologue. In this presentation, I'll focus on showing you how I did it. I employ digitality as a way of thinking about these questions, as a hermeneutic. Before going into this idea, let me share with you some of the details of the challenge I faced in speaking between the complexity and heterogeneity of context on the one hand, and the universal on the other. So the context I was dealing with included Christianity as a factor of religious socialization and identity, which brings about notions of in-groupness, concepts of intertextuality as discussed by George Limbeck, for example, from a public theology perspective. It brought about issues of religious plurality and how that is managed. And that itself is a context. Another context was youthfulness. And demography can be a type of context on its own, which introduces its peculiarities to the conversation. So can be social media itself as a space for interaction, for the development of network society and internet culture. Ghana as a country, and whether the arbitrariness of the nation state provided a useful enough ground for discussing the boundaries of the topic. But then there was also Africa, and how did Ghana connect with Africa? Was I going to be discussing African Christianity, African youthfulness, or Ghanaian? And that brought along the baggage of all the discussions around Westernization versus nativist approaches to discussions of culture. And of course, personhood and humanity, which were the main focuses of my research, brought with them the issue of how anthropology, deals with the psychic unity of humanity at the same time as recognizing hybridity and cultural diffusion and cross-cultural contact. And digitality's mediation of all of that provides even further complication to these concepts. So the complexity involved in such a multivalent terrain naturally leads to a sense of daunting mystery of how digital interactions happen and of how we might go about tracking their effects. But I offer that this obfuscation has an upside that may in fact be its very opposite. That is a form of disclosure or revealing. By digitality as a hermeneutic, I do not mean thinking atomistically or in binary structuralist terms as proposed in the sometimes cognate field of digital philosophy. I mean more generally what digitality shows or reveals to us. 3 years ago, Damian Guzek and Jan Slomka spoke at this conference of technology as a way of revealing, drawing from Martin Heidegger. This inspired me to explore how digitality does this, and in what follows, I share some broad ways in which it helped me see contextual differences in a new way. In sum, for each of these contextual lines I have already mentioned, digitality helped me arrive at principles from which to conceptualize, justify, and then construct the theological anthropology that I eventually did. And so for Christianity, in digitality, we find that there is no escape. Digitality becomes a means of collapsing the church world boundary. Conversation becomes embedded in the phenomenology of Christianity. This extends the already recognized effect of the collapse of the public and the private. But it does more. It brings theology closer to public engagement as it attunes its language to the ones deemed most effective in social media. This way, even the most internally directed preaching, for example, is already in conversation. On youth and digital media, Digitality reminds us of the imaginative and self-exploratory spirit of youth. I concluded that digitality may not homogenize youth subcultural formations and expressions, but it provides consistent communicative structures within which subcultures and identities form. This consists mainly in the accordance of identity shaping value by youth to their technologies. Thus, part of the answer to the question of how digitality shapes identity may lie in the almost universal sense we have that they do. On borders, we tend to think of political borders geographically, which is a proxy almost for their putative naturalness. But when we do recognize their political sources, we tend to see them as determinant of cultural boundedness as well. But digital networks expose the arbitrariness of the nation state, the centrality of new economic borders being drawn on the basis of statistical aggregations of tastes, interests, and personal and bodily subjective conditions. In short, we are witnessing the retribalization of humanity. That this process is so ubiquitously successful itself suggests another hermeneutical key. There is something about our personal and cultural differences that brings us together in new ways, even if unconsciously. To conclude, I came to the following general principles which guided my work. First, if digitality exposes the sameness of communicative structures, think memes, though not necessarily the communicated content itself, then maybe there is some unity to how we think online, even if not in what we think online necessarily. Second, theology has long suggested this to be the case. And even the strongest voices on the need to recognize difference and contextuality, thinkers like Kwame Bediako, Andrew Walls, Desmond Tutu, and more recently, Kwabena Asamoah-Gyedu, also theologically affirm a unity of humanity rooted in creation and sacramentality of time and space, Christology, and the possibility of a pneumatologically enabled relationality and ecclesia. Even the concept of translatability, as developed by Lamin Sana and others, speaks to the universality of the communicative and relational structures that underpin human subjectivity, structures that are enabled by digitality. On this basis, then, I concluded that digitality exposes us to be multi-contextual beings, multi-identitarian, plurally belonging, and individually unique beings at the same time. And I found justification on this basis for engaging both local and foreign, historical and contemporary voices in my research. These included thinkers like Anthony Giddens, Manuel Castells, Kwame Gyekye, and Soren Kierkegaard. In sum then, and this is my final point, digital culture with all its complexity, scale, pace, and black box mysteriousness forces us to ask the important question, what the hell are we doing and becoming? It thus provides occasion for the kind of introspection that leads to new vistas of our natures. It is a way of revealing, as Heidegger tried to teach us. It is a way of revealing through hiding, mediated by a subjective introspection that hopefully is communally navigated. As digital culture advances into a phase dominated by AI, quantum computing, and an Internet of Things, its hiding ability is only going to get better. So too, hopefully, will its revealing function, if we will do the work of introspecting. Thank you.